discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
And welcome back to Reason and Theology, getting back into the swing of things on a Monday morning. Welcome to the show, everybody, and welcome to our guest, Pat Flynn. How are you, sir? Good to have you back on.
I'm great. Just getting back from Tulsa, and I live in Wisconsin. So, gave a little talk down there for the Alcuin Institute, and it was a fun time, and I didn't get sucked up by a tornado, so all was well.
So was this a drive that you made or a plane flight?
Yeah, we flew, my wife and I. It was actually her birthday, so I'm like, how else do you want to spend your birthday except for in Tulsa, Oklahoma? So why don't you come along? And
listening to you talk.
and getting some airport food. I mean, we got to treat them right. You know how it is, Michael.
So y'all didn't get a chance to go out and explore everything?
No, they treated us well. We didn't get to explore the area very much. Yeah. My understanding is a really awesome monastery down there, which we totally did not get to see, unfortunately.
Is that Clear Creek Abbey?
It is. It's exactly that. And I had no idea this existed until they told me about it. If I would have known beforehand, I would have wanted to spend an extra day or two. But yeah, no, it was a quick zip in, zip out type of thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's great. And by the way, I see something new on the wall there, how to be better at almost everything. What exactly is that? Is that a book?
Yeah, so that was my 2019 book. And so the theme of that book is generalism. And what I argue in that book, it's actually a book geared largely towards entrepreneurs, but I think it fits pretty much everybody. And my thesis is, generally speaking, you're better off being good to great, or at least fairly competent at a wide range of skills, and then learning to stack those skills to form competitive advantages in life, rather than just trying to be a hyper specialist or the best at any one thing. And that's what that book tries to argue. It argues for skill stacking, generalism, and an approach to acquiring a diverse range of skills. Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Is it on Amazon?
It is. Yeah, it's in most places you should be able to get books. It's done pretty well, and this actually right next to it is the Chinese translation. It just showed up one day, and I was like, "What is this?" And I can't read it. And I'm like, "Oh, this is my book in Chinese." So I put it up there. Yeah,
it looks like a Superman logo.
Yeah, it's actually here. I'll pull it down for your audience. Yeah. It's I thought the original cover was funky, but this one's even crazier. Look at that. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of philosophy in here, and it's funny, Michael. I wrote this book smack dab in the middle of my conversion, actually.
Okay.
So people who know me and my story actually can tell, like halfway through this book, like the tone really starts to shift.
Does it?
About like what's important in life, because like the first half you might think I'm a materialistic hedonist, which I kind of was, and then the second half, I'm starting to try and consider wider perspectives and different priorities in life. And that really reflects what I was going through personally at the time. So it was actually a really tough book to write for that reason. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. So is there going to be a part 2 now that you fully converted? And
yeah, hopefully, if it keeps selling decently enough, they'll ask me to do a revised edition, and I would definitely overhaul significant amounts of that book. But then at that point, it'll be like a religious book, and they won't even want to sell it anymore,
That's true. That's very true. It'll put it in a different category at that point, for sure. Well, let's talk about the topic at hand. So we're talking about the toughest argument or the toughest critique that an atheist might offer against theism. What, in your estimation, is that argument?
Yeah, there's always obviously there's always an aspect of subjectivity here, right? What is the best argument that has most concerned me or even convinced me back when I was an atheist, right? And then there's, I guess, maybe if you were to take a poll among philosophers, what do they think the best argument is? And honestly, Michael, I think Aquinas got it right, because if you remember in his Summa, when he's considering God's existence, he really only considers 2 objections against the existence of God, right? He considers famously the problem of evil, which we've talked about on your show before. You had Gavin and I come on and address the problem of evil, and we can revisit that today if you like. But then he also considers another objection. And that other objection is that you just don't need God to explain everything that stands in need of an explanation, right? That sort of nature is sufficient. And I want to say Aquinas was really, really smart, as we know, because if you look at the contemporary philosophical scene, philosophy of religion, where I spend most of my time, That's pretty much what it comes down to, right? Atheists usually take one or two of those options, sometimes both, right? So, I mean, think of somebody like a pretty prominent atheist, Paul Draper. He's real big on pushing the problem of evil, right? He thinks that is like disconfirmatory of theism. Obviously, I don't agree, but that's the approach. But then other, sophisticated atheists, say like Graham Oppie, he'll say, look, theism and atheism pretty much explain as much, right? They're kind of like on an explanatory par, which I don't think is true, and we can talk about that. But atheism is simpler, and we should just, if two things explain just as much, then believe the simpler theory, believe the simpler hypothesis, and for that reason, he'll say believe atheism. And I just find that eminently fascinating, right? It's like that. This is just Aquinas's. Nothing is ever really new, right? Now there's other objections, and there are some novel difficulties, but those are the two. I think that's right. I think those are always the two sort of perennial concern. Always have been, always will be. Sorry, you wanted to chime in?
Well, so I guess you would say that you don't agree that atheism is the more simple view.
Oh, yeah, not at all. Yeah, not at all.
And why?
Yeah, so it's funny because we were just having this conversation with Dr. Joshua Sijuwati, and we mentioned that any talk about simplicity in philosophy, whether it's talking about divine simplicity or the theoretical virtue of simplicity, is always enormously complicated, which is the irony when dealing with notions of simplicity. So first off, when it comes to kind of evaluating a theory's simplicity, well, maybe we should talk about why do we think simplicity is important in the first place? That's probably important. So
yeah,
in philosophy and maybe we can even zoom out a little bit more and talk about different approaches to God. I'm sorry, I keep expanding the conversation, but I think this stuff is important, right? So, in contemporary philosophy of religion, what happens is people engage in what's called worldview comparison. And a worldview is just sort of a big picture of reality, right? This is like, what's the fundamental theory that's just going to make sense of the whole of human experience, right? And it's actually quite sort of scientific in its methodology, because what philosophers of religion do is they form a worldview hypothesis, for example, like classical theism or naturalism. Then they try to argue that their hypothesis is more sort of virtuous as a theory. And by that, there's certain criteria that are not universally agreed upon, but at least agreed upon enough of like what makes for a good theory. Things like fit with background knowledge, explanatory comprehensiveness, and simplicity. Simplicity is a big one. And I think it is important right away to say that simplicity is really a secondary consideration, right? It's not like it's a consideration. It's not the consideration, because you have many very simple theories, theories that are simpler both than theism and atheism, but we don't accept those theories because they just explain nothing. So here's a simple theory. Nothing exists, right? Hard to get much simpler than that, right? But we think that theory sucks, right? Because it's definitely false, right? So whatever else simplicity is, it's definitely not the consideration. It's a consideration. And in fact, we think that it's less of a consideration than explanatory comprehensiveness, right? So as simple as we can make a theory, so long as it sort of can still cover all the data that needs to be covered, right? Now, why is simplicity important? Well, there's this idea that if the more sort of basic components a theory has, like the more sort of moving parts a theory has, it seems like the more ways that theory could go wrong or turn out to be false. And if this is right, then it seems like simplicity is sort of a flag to modesty, and it's sort of an indicator of a theory's sort of like internal likelihood, right? How likely it is to be true. So some examples can help us understand this. So imagine I walk outside and I discover there's just like wetness on the ground, right? And and it's all very intuitive. I immediately form a hypothesis. It rained, right? But now I realize that it's just my driveway that's wet, and it's not the entire neighborhood. Well, now I start to think, okay, maybe that isn't such a great hypothesis. Why? Not because that hypothesis predicts too little. It actually predicts too much. It's over predictive, right? So I start to consider sort of competing hypotheses. Okay, maybe my sprinkler turned on, right? All right, that's relatively simple. I've seen it happen before. It might be able to sort of explain the restricted range of wetness. It would explain why the neighborhood as a whole isn't wet. But here's a competing hypothesis. My driveway is wet because 20 kids with buckets of water came along and 3 birds came overhead and spit, right?
Yeah.
Now that explains the data just as well, right? That the data fits with that theory just as well. So, but like almost none of us think that that's the correct theory. Now, why?
Right.
well, it seems like there's just a lot more moving parts with that theory that would have to like issues of coordination and timing. There's so many more ways that that theory could be false, right? That we think that it's just so. Now, we're not saying it's definitely not true. Maybe it is true. We're just saying other considerations equal. It just is so probabilistically less likely. That's why we consider the sprinkler theory or something else like that. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the intuition behind simplicity.
It definitely does. But could it be that something actually is true that is more complex, even though the simpler explanation has the explanatory power? It just so happens that something that is more complex turns out to be where the truth is. I guess what you're saying is
all the time.
Maybe that's possible.
All the time.
But so I think what you're saying is maybe that's possible, but it would be more modest to say it's more likely that the simpler explanation is the one that's true, unless we have reason to believe the more complex one.
Not only could it be, it has been, right? Just historically, we've often moved from less simple theories to more complicated ones. There's many examples of that in science. But the idea is it's just a form of probabilistic reasoning. Like, hey, if you're going to take your bet, right? Shoot,
Right.
Bet on the simpler one. It's definitely not decisive.
Sure. Okay. All right.
And this is sort of like Occam's. You often hear Occam's razor, right? Don't multiply entities beyond necessity to explain a particular phenomenon. There's very similar themes here.
But you would say that atheism doesn't offer the explanatory power, though it might be the more simple presentation.
I deny both. I think it's more complex and explanatorily inadequate. So we can examine both. But when it comes to worldview comparisons, evaluations of simplicity are really tough, right? There's different types of simplicity that philosophers consider. There's like syntactical simplicity. There's quantitative simplicity, qualitative simplicity. So here's what I think is essentially right. I think where simplicity matters most is on the fundamental level. What's fundamental to your theory? I don't think it's right to say that a theory that just includes less things is a simpler theory. So let me motivate that because this is sometimes what you'll hear an atheist say. They'll say, well, look, we just have the world, but you have the world and God, right? So therefore your theory is more complex. And the reason I think that's wrong is I think it's horribly confused. And smart atheists don't actually usually say this, but you do hear this on the popular level. One is like, well, what do we mean by world? Because if the world is just like totality of reality, then if God exists, God is in the world, right? But also, we have to differentiate the data to be explained from the theory that explains the data. Largely, theists and atheists agree on the data to be explained, that there's concrete, causally capable objects, that there's conscious beings, so on and so forth, right? What we're trying to argue for is what is the correct theory to explain the data. And especially what is your fundamental theory? So it's not enough just to like recite the data. We agree on the data, right? What's your theory that explains the data, right? And here's one: classical theism, right? Now, what is the naturalist theory going to have to be? Well, you can't just recite the data. You have to give us a theory that explains the data, and in that and you have to give us a theory that excludes theism, right? Because if you're a naturalist, you have to say that whatever your theory is, God is incompatible with it, right? So at that point, the naturalist is going to have to posit some fundamental theory that sort of blocks theism from fitting with it, right? Okay, so now going back to the idea of why I think it's wrong that just a worldview with less things in it isn't necessarily the simpler worldview. I mean, take I'll borrow an example from my friend Tim McGrew. Imagine that you have a theory of history, right? And you're trying to explain American history, but you're trying to do it without Abraham Lincoln, right? And you try to argue, well, look, I believe the same things that you do, Mr. Normal Historian. I just have one less president than you do, so my theory is simpler. But now here's the thing, right? Because you still have to explain the same amount of data, but now you've dropped out an entity that offered a lot of explanatory power to that data. So now to make up for that, you now have to like come up with some like grand conspiracy theory of why we have all this data that we do that we normally think fits really well with the Abraham Lincoln existed theory. Right. And so now we have to sort of wire in a bunch of ad hoc components to our theory to try and make sense of the data of everything surrounding what seemed to be Abraham Lincoln's existence, that at the end of the day is going to be enormously complicated, like secret backdoor conspiracy theory meetings, like collaboration among the media, like it's almost impossible to imagine like what kind of story could you possibly concoct, right? Better just to have Abraham Lincoln in there. Yeah. And in the sense that even if you have that extra like ontological item, it's still a simpler theory than the one with the huge conspiracy web, if that makes sense, right? Because that conspiracy web has so many more ways that it could go wrong, that in the most relevant sense, no, I'll just take the extra entity and still insist that my theory is simpler, right?
And so is that actually why the atheist proposal is more complex? Because though it offers one less entity in the universe, it actually doesn't account for the existence of the universe, and it makes it much more complicated to explain the universe.
Yeah, so I think that the atheist is always going to really struggle in this regard, right? Because here's the deal with theism. It is enormously successful in terms of prediction and explanation. First off, it's an enormously simple fundamental theory, especially if you're like us, Michael, and you hold to divine simplicity. I mean, you have one fundamental entity, either with 1 or 0 properties, right? So in terms of the two categories of simplicity that really matter, say quantitative and qualitative simplicity, how many entities do you have and how complex are those entities? How can you beat that, right? How you just can't, right? So the atheistic, and the reason I'm being, I guess, a little vague is because there's many different atheistic theories out there, right? Like naturalism is a big tent. But I at least want to say this, right? In order to like keep up with theism in the explanatory race, because theism explains a lot of stuff really easy. It explains why anything exists, right? It explains why things have causal powers. It explains why there is consciousness really well. It explains why there's rationality really well. It explains why there's a moral landscape really well, right? It explains teleology really well. Like theism, it explains and predicts these things really, really well. So what does just atheism by itself say? Well, it just said that there is no God. Well, as a theory, that's junk, right? What would you expect from a theory that just says something doesn't exist? Like, what does that lead you to anticipate? What does that theory predict? And the answer is zilch, nothing, right? So it's just junk. It doesn't do anything. So now you need a theory of naturalism, which means you need to start like building out your fundamental theory that can try and like keep up with theism, which just would lead you to expect really all those things and more, I would argue. So theism is like really explanatorily powerful. And I think it's important to point out, most atheists do not disagree with this, right? If anything, the atheists will just say that theism is too predictively powerful in a sense that it predicts too much, sort of like the rain example we gave, right? And what do we mean by that? Well, maybe theism would predict, if God is perfect, it would predict a perfect world. So it over predicts, which is a problem if you think that our world has suffering and evil, for example. Okay. So that's important. It's like most atheists, the sophisticated ones, do not disagree that theism is really powerful in terms of its explanatory resources. In fact, they just think that it might have a little too much, might over predict, right? So going back to atheism then, all right, well, now we need a theory to try and explain that huge range of data. Why something exists, why consciousness exists, why reasoning beings exist. I would argue why free will exists. And this is where it gets tough, right? Because in order to kind of compare paradigms, we do have to agree on the data to be explained. So if you think free will exists, well, now we need a fundamental theory that can make sense of free will. I don't think any atheistic theory can do that. And I think that's why most atheists deny free will, right? But to me, that's a huge explanatory cost. But then again, I don't think atheism can explain any of that stuff. I don't think naturalism can explain why anything exists instead of not. I don't think naturalism can explain why consciousness exists instead of not. So what the atheist has to do then is they sort of have to like put a bunch of additional brute components into their theory, right? They just have to say that it's just a sort of brute fact that there are moral principles, for example, right? Or that's a brute fact that there are reasoning principles, for example. Or we're going to either eliminate consciousness or we're going to become panpsychists and try and put consciousness at the bottom of reality. But now we have all these disparate components all over the place. And a lot of atheists are also what are called ontological pluralists. So they think that there's not just one fundamental thing, there's like many fundamental things. So hopefully you can see how, as I'm beginning to sketch this theory, I think most people's intuitions will say, well, that just seems really complicated, right? And the answer is it is, and it has to be if it's going to have any chance of keeping up with the exceptionally simple theistic hypothesis. So at least minimally, I always want to say that theism is a hypothesis that can explain the most with the absolute least on the fundamental level, while offering a more unified explanation of sort of phenomena that's higher up, where atheism can't do that, right? The best it can do is just kind of like posit as brute facts different components into their theory that would otherwise seem to require a deeper, more unified explanation, but in principle cannot find one because the theory excludes God, if that makes sense.
So why can't they appeal to brute facts? What are the rest of the problems with it?
Well, they can appeal to brute facts, which a lot of them do, whether it's brute contingencies or brute necessities. I'm just saying the moment you do that, I think you've lost the debate for two reasons. One is, remember, the debate sort of hinged on the idea that theism and atheism can explain just as much. But look, you have brute facts, which theism can explain further, right? We can explain more than you. We can give a deeper, more unified explanation of things that you just have to leave brute. And for the gentle listeners, a brute fact is something that it makes sense to ask why it exists or why it's there. But it doesn't explain its own existence, and nothing else explains its existence, right? So it's something where its intelligibility is restricted. We think that it should be able to be raised in intelligibility by some external cause or something like that. But it can't be, right? It's just there. And as Bertrand Russell said of the universe, and that's all. That's the end of the story, right?
Give me an example.
Well, take Bertrand Russell of the universe, right? He just would say that the physical universe, it's just there, and that's it. But theism, that doesn't seem, that seems totally wrong, right? It seems like the universe is a contingent reality. It's bounded. It's arbitrarily restricted in various ways. It seems like it has limits that cry out for a deeper explanation, right? Not only why is there any universe, but why this particular universe? And theism, obviously through various cosmological arguments, which we can get into, gives an explanation of that. And I would argue a really good one. So here's something that crucially demands an explanation that, at least for some atheists, cannot find a deeper explanation on atheism, but can on theism, right? So we've now found something that breaks the stalemate, or the supposed stalemate, in terms of explanatory comprehensiveness, right?
So when they appeal to these brute facts, is it sort of equivalent to them just saying, well, when they get in a bind and can't explain something, they just say, it is what it is? Effectively it?
I try to be, I mean, look, you're laughing at brute facts, and I laugh at it too. So let me be honest about brute facts. This will get me into a little bit of trouble. I think it's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, I think the brute fact objection, and we have to be careful here, because we don't want to like switch dialogues or switch the sort of dialectical context. Sometimes a brute fact, it depends what game we're playing. So this brings us back to approaches to God. Sometimes one approach to God is this, and it's one of giving a metaphysical demonstration. Hey, look, there's things that have a real distinction between their essence and existence, right? There's things that don't carry the reason for their existence intrinsic to themselves. They're always pointing beyond themselves. They have existence in a derivative way. And this logically forces us to get to something whose essence just is its existence, that has existence in a sort of built-in, robust way, is purely actual. That's God, right? Well, if the atheist wants to take that down, I think the silliest yet strongest objection is the brute fact objection. They'll just say, well, look, we're tracing along this causal line, and we're just going to get to something that, it would seem like it's sort of modally contingent. It is, but it doesn't have to be. But that's the end of it. That's the end of the explanatory story. It's just a brute fact. What's for dinner, right? And you're just like, what? Hold on, dude. Right?
Yeah, right.
That's so, and it's hard not to laugh at that. But I mean, like, look, that is like traditionally kind of like the most serious objection in terms of like very sophisticated atheists posit that. You have Bertrand Russell, you have sort of J.L. Mackie. He posits a sort of, kind of view like this. Bill Rowe kind of posits a view like this. And ultimately, it kind of comes down to whether you think that something like the principle of sufficient reason is true or not, right? Is the universe actually intelligible, or is it fundamentally absurd, right? And my perspective is like, you can't have any bruteness in an intelligible universe, right? The moment you let any bruteness in, it sort of just contaminates everything, right? And just and you think about that, right? I mean, like, say you're kind of like going down this sort of causal regress, you're doing your metaphysics, you're talking with the atheist, and you get to some sort of reality that seems like it should have a deeper explanation. Say it's a turtle or a Disney princess, right? You're just like thinking about, like, yeah, fundamental reality is a Disney princess or a turtle, as my friend Josh Rasmussen likes to say. And you're like, that just seems totally odd, right? That just does not, or like, I'm being funny here, but it could be particles, it could be physical fields, whatever they want to posit, right?
Sure.
But these things are not relevantly different, right?
Mm-hmm.
From
Mm-hmm.
everything else that is always a dependent, contingent cause reality. And as soon as you admit that that it can just be by a brute fact, it seems like brute facts could be anywhere and everywhere. It seems like all of our beliefs could be brute facts. It seems like anything that I believe, instead of being formed in the right sort of way, of being sort of connected with reality through the right sort of causal lines, is just happening as a brute fact for no reason whatsoever. And as soon as you do that, I want to say epistemology is done, rationality is done, and you're just sort of sucked into a radically skeptical abyss. And it's been me thinking about this, and originally thinking about it as an atheist, and now continuing to think about it as a theist, is that, yeah, to me, the more I thought about this, Michael, the more I've realized I don't think the alternatives are really theism and atheism. I think the alternatives are like theism and absurdism, if that makes sense. Because as soon as you try to, like, I don't see how atheists aren't stuck with brute facts somewhere. And as soon as you do that, it just seems to me that reality is absurd, right? And I don't think atheists want to say that, right? Because they want science. They want to be able to give a theory. They are committed, at least implicitly, in their operations and arguments, that reality is not fundamentally absurd. But no, yeah, it seems right to me. The more I've thought about this, the more I think atheism just does entail absurdism, because it cannot exist without brute facts. And the only way to drive brute facts to zero is with a theistic worldview, where you can get to something that could be, in principle, self-explanatory. And for that to happen, it has to escape all the categories of things that would normally require a cause, that are restrictedly intelligible, that are composite, that are finite, that are contingent. And the only thing that could possibly do that is the thing that we've all sort of traditionally identified as the purely actual self-subsistent absolute, which is God, if that makes sense.
You mentioned earlier that most of them maintain, I guess, determinism because they deny free will. Why do they resort to that? Why can't they just say, "Oh, I maintain free will"? Why is that something they deny?
Yeah, some atheists try to, from a compatibilist perspective. I think compatibilism just collapses to determinism. I'm a libertarian. So, I mean, it seems it's hard, right? So if you're an atheist, and it seems like you kind of have two options, right? You kind of have a sort of hard determinism, where some sort of prior factor is really sort of logically sufficient for an effect, right? In a way that it entails this effect in this particular way. Or maybe you're going to, like, look to quantum mechanics and say that there's some form of indeterminism there. But when you look at it that way, that's not really a way to secure free will, because that's kind of like a randomness, and free will isn't random, right? And this is actually a perennial objection to free will. People will say, well, look, if something isn't determined in a strong way, it's just sort of random. And neither of those are good options for the proponent of free will, right? Because it seems like free will, is neither determined nor random. And I want to say, yeah, that's right. So you need a worldview that can give you a third category, really a category of what's called rational willing. And if people want to hear an account of that, I argue that an Aristotelian theistic worldview can give you exactly that category. And I have an article on Catholic Answers called something like "Physics is Not the Full Story," where I argue how this worldview can secure free will, but by giving you that sort of third category that you need to avoid the dilemma pressed against the proponent of free will. However, I think that sort of that paradigm can only be made sense of if theism is true. I don't think that paradigm fits into an atheistic world.
Okay, so rational willing, you would say, cannot be reconciled with atheism.
I don't believe so. No, reasons-based action. You need a substance-first view, and a substance-first view is where the whole can, in a real way, be in control of its component parts, like we are, right? And I don't see how you're gonna, in a reduction, in a sort of physicalist, naturalist, reductivist worldview, you could make sense of that ontology. I don't think that ontology fits. It certainly doesn't fit easily with atheism. I don't think it fits at all. So you need a worldview that can give you this type of ontology where there's a substance first ontology. Then you can make sense of free will. And theism gives you that. Atheism doesn't. So some of these get really complicated, but that is, I think, a big point score for theism, because as soon as free will's off the table, yeah, I think rationality goes with it, right? I mean, rationality and our ability to, the laws of physics are not the laws of logic, right?
Yeah, right.
This is really important to get that right, right? Like,
it seems like they assumed them, right? I mean,
yeah, so I think this is, again, personally, this is something that really kind of moved me away from atheism. He's like, wow, rationality is an obvious aspect of our world, and these atheistic theories are really making it hard for me to make sense of reason itself. Theism doesn't have that problem, I don't think. Yeah.
Before we get to some chat questions, were there any other points that we didn't explore yet that you wanted to touch on?
So we were talking about it's funny that you were laughing at the brute fact objection. So I was in Tulsa, I did the Catholic Man show, and they were laughing at it too. And I'm like, guys, we got to try and take it seriously, because this is like, this is like the objection, right? And it is just funny to see how, like, people who aren't in these specialized debates, how they just don't take it seriously.
Yeah.
And that's not insignificant, right? If something like is that just so counterintuitive,
right?
I think it should cause you to question how serious of a response that is. But at the end of the day, at the same time, if I were to push atheism as far as I could, it wouldn't be the problem of evil. I'm not actually that impressed with the problem of evil. It would be the brute fact objection. Yeah, because maybe we should talk about the problem of evil. I think
so. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, first off, let me say this. I would, if atheism were true, I wouldn't expect the problem of evil. Now, why? Because there's certain evil itself is the occurrence of evil. It entails a lot of things. What does it entail, right? For us to make the judgment that there's evil entails that there are conscious beings that are capable of moral knowledge, that live in a contingent universe. And I don't think atheism can clear any of those hurdles in principle.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So if you can't clear the hurdles on the way to the judgment of evil, then you cannot possibly, then like these evidential considerations just are pointless. Right. I mean, yeah, think of it this way. Right. I mean, like, imagine somebody, like, there's an obstacle course race, right? And the final obstacle was like lifting a boulder and putting it up on a pedestal. And the guy who's going to and say there's a competitor there, and he's like really burly in the upper body. So you think he might be able to lift this boulder and put it on a pedestal, right? But in order to get to that, he's got to clear a bunch of other obstacles that involve running and jumping and swimming and all this other stuff. And then you find out he's got no legs, right? and like whatever else you want to do, but like that would make it impossible for him to clear those obstacles. Well, then however good he would be at lifting the boulder is irrelevant, because he's never going to get there. And that's how I think about atheism, right? It's like, if you think that atheism can get to a certain point, right, which is when everything else is online of rational beings and consciousness and a contingent universe, then yeah, atheism run by a principle of indifference, because that's sort of what the atheistic hypothesis is run by, a principle of indifference, right? Then you might think at that point it has some explanatory force of why there's as much suffering as there is in the world, right? But I'm saying it can't even get there, right? It doesn't even have a chance of getting there. Whereas theism clearly does. And then it's this question of, well, should we expect suffering and evil on theism, or does theism overpredict? And I don't think theism overpredicts at all. I think theism actually entails a world pretty much like ours. And I'll just give a sketch, and then you can poke at it if you want. So from a classical theistic perspective, remember that God is perfectly good. He's a subsistent good, but only God is metaphysically impeccable, right? Everything else God creates is metaphysically fallible. It's a composite of potency and act. It not only is not its own sort of moral standard, because it's not the good itself. It's a participated good. It's a participated existence. It could fail, in other words. Well, that's true for us as human beings, right? We're not sort of the moral rule, like God is the moral rule as the self-subsistent good. We participate in being just as we participate in humanity, but we always have to sort of like look beyond ourselves for the moral rule. And so our liberty is very different from God. It's a mistake to think that freedom entails the ability to sin. Clearly not, right? Because God can't sin. This is a mistake people make with a free will defense. That's not right. However, what there is a sort of free will defense to be found in philosophical anthropology, where we realize that, yes, we're creatures of liberty, but we're creatures of a metaphysical fallible liberty, right? And that is a metaphysical necessity because only God is metaphysically infallible, right? So if God's going to aim for love, which I think is perfectly expected if God exists, of friendships, love, and communion with creatures like us, it just is a sort of metaphysical necessity that has to bring in independent free wills, which are, since they are not God, that possible failures, right? They just could fail. They could make a moral miscalculation given their nature, right? Well, then it also just seems very probable that at some point they will make a moral miscalculation, right? It seems like there would be something like a fall. Okay. Well, now I'm kind of arguing that classical theism, I think, actually predicts Christianity or something very close to it. Now, might God have sort of good reasons for allowing a world like ours with as much suffering and evil? Certainly, because we think that so a lot of moral evil can just be explained by our moral miscalculations, but suffering can also be extremely medicinal. It can provide opportunities for redemption, for reductions in egoism, superficiality, false notions of just robust independence, which aren't true. It can bring us to repentance. It can cause our will to acquiesce so we can accept God's further grace, right? So no, actually, a world of suffering and evil, what I'm saying, especially this world, right? This world that when we think about it, yes, there's a lot of suffering and evil, but it seems to be like a finely tuned amount of suffering and evil, if that makes sense, right? It's neither too much nor too little, because we can easily imagine worlds, especially an atheistic world, where like everybody despairs and commits suicide. That's not the world we live in, right? We could also imagine a world where there's just like one mosquito bite. That would seem too little. You see what I mean? So I'm actually suggesting that the amount of suffering and evil we have in the world, which is a lot, don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying, it's a lot, but given everything else we've just said, it seems like it falls like just within that sort of narrow range of all the ways our world could have had more or less suffering and evil that we would expect if God exists and is trying to draw us back to himself, if that makes sense. Plus, I think theism entails an afterlife. So if this life isn't the end of the story, then the atheist, I would argue, is always going to be question begging if they claim that some evils are unjustified, right? That there are some gratuitous evils. How are you ever going to prove that, right? You can't. If theism entails an afterlife and if God is perfectly good, then the theist has good reason to think that none of the evils, even if they haven't seemed to have been conquered or defeated in this life, are never conquered or defeated. And that just all seems right to me. So I would say the more I've thought about it, the more it just has seemed absolutely correct to me that no, theism is not over predictive. If I think you do the metaphysics, this is exactly the type of world we expect with a perfectly good God, the God of classical theism, and not at all the world we would expect if naturalism is true. So in that sense, I want to say initially, evil might seem like a problem for God. Substantially, evil points toward the existence of God. Does that make sense?
It does. And that's something I haven't considered before, because for me, I've kind of just been under the impression that the strongest critique of theism, and especially Christianity, has been the problem of evil. So that there's some really good food for thought there.
Yeah, it's a problem. Look, I've thought about that for well over a decade at this point, right? And but the more I've thought about it, the more what I just said seems obviously right. Like, yes, no, that's definitely true, right? Atheism can explain consciousness. It can explain rationality. It can explain morality. It can explain being, right? And then you think more deeply about the nature of God and the nature of any creature. And then it seems like, yes, no, a perfect being can't create other perfect beings because there can only be one perfect being. So everything else God creates will be metaphysically fallible. Could God, now here's another thing, could God give special graces to everybody all the time, like he did to Blessed Mother, to stop us from sinning? Yes, but that's sort of like the order of miracle. And in the general run, a perfectly good God's going to guide things according to their nature, and our nature is fallible, right? So yes, God can perform miracles, and there's a reason that God does perform miracles when he does, right? However, if God just did miracles nonstop, that makes nonsense of creation. Right. At that point, why are you even creating natures to begin with at all? And God is not in the business of nonsense.
Right.
So
that's a good point. Yeah. You know, I think what it is it's just that the average person probably just has that knee-jerk reaction, that emotional reaction whenever we hear the problem of evil, and we just don't tend to think through it as deeply as you presented it there.
Yeah, it takes a lot of patience, and it's
mm,
hard, man. Like, I mean,
mhm.
I actually, you need to take a break from it, because if you're dealing with the problem of evil for so long and your mind
Yeah,
is just constantly on the suffering of the world, and then like
right.
you're like that, it weighs on you. It
Sure.
really does. But it's also kind of like a selection bias at that point, right?
Yeah.
So you
That's
just got to be careful as a philosopher, just psychologically. I'm even saying. Mhm.
We have just a few more minutes, so I want to grab these chat questions.
Sure.
From Yajun. Why is divine simplicity a good argument against atheism, if
I
not
think.
all atheists accept it?
Yeah. So I'll just reiterate some of what we talked about with respect to our conversation with Dr. Sijuwati. If we think about the nature of explanation and the types of things that demand explanation, I want to say that compositeness is kind of like it, right? I think actually you can explain a thing's contingency by examining its metaphysical composition, especially between essence and existence. So if you want a principled explanation ender, divine simplicity gives you a really good one. And it gives you an incredible amount of simplicity, right? So it gives you a great explanatory stopping point with an extremely simple fundamental theory. Now, why do not all theists accept it? I mean, it's a hard thing to wrap your mind around, which is not surprising because we're talking about God. So I've never found people who struggle. There's a lot of people who say they reject divine simplicity because they find it unintelligible or they can't comprehend it. And I'm like, come on. I mean, why should God be easy to comprehend? Right. Where is that expectation coming from? Right. If God were easy to comprehend, my worry is that you've got a creature in mind. Like, we're not really thinking about God then. Plus, a lot of really smart people a lot smarter than I, seem to have comprehended it pretty well. So even if I didn't quite comprehend it, I'm not saying like we get the essence of God. We cannot, right? But it seems to me that you can make the notion perfectly philosophically coherent. You can swat down all the objections. And this is just where the arguments lead. So everybody should accept it because it is the best theory of fundamentality that I've ever come across. And frankly, if divine simplicity wasn't on the table, I don't know if I would have given up naturalism for theism, right? Because you don't have that sort of like principled category shift, if that makes sense.
Josh is asking, for people investigating atheism from a classical thrust position, what are some tips when reading philosophers like Opie?
Yeah, so Graham Oppy is a very, very intelligent atheistic naturalistic philosopher. I enjoy reading his stuff a lot. And like I said, he would take more of the you don't need God as an explanation, and atheism is simpler type of theory. I would say just look out for the things that I've seen. Watch how many sort of brute facts Oppy needs to kind of posit. He'll posit a bunch of brute necessities. I also just don't think that Oppy can has ever given a very satisfactory explanatory account of various phenomena, including consciousness. Oppy, if I remember right, is a functionalist with respect to philosophy of mind and stuff like that. So I would actually just say a lot of what we covered in this conversation is exactly what you should keep in mind when engaging with philosophers like that. And I say that because those are the philosophers I read, right? So this is how I think about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Last question here. This is from Lewis. Can you comment on the idea that we live in the best possible universe?
Yeah. So this is a very complicated matter, right? So there are certain philosophers, kind of in the tradition of Leibniz, that think that there's a couple ways to think about this, right? That either God would necessarily create, and if he does create, it would be the best of all possible worlds, right? Mm-hmm. Or that maybe God won't necessarily create, but if he does create and he's free to create, then he will only create the best of all possible worlds. Okay. Where do I fall on this? Well, I don't think God had to create necessarily, so I reject that. I don't think that there's a best of all possible worlds, but I do think that there probably is a best kind of world. And I think that is what God created. And if you want, and I'll take another question with this. I saw somebody ask what I think the best book on animal suffering is. And that'll cover two things. And I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It'll cover this question in more detail. And the way the author thinks about it, the author's Trent Doherty thinks about it, is kind of the same way I think about it now, that there might be a best kind of world. And there might be many sort of ways that God had created that's consistent with the best kind of world, right? So it's not just like one world that's like that, but it would fall within this best kind of world. The book is called, oh gosh, what is it called? All God's Creatures. It's Trent Doherty's book on animal suffering. And he's going to argue in that book, I think quite convincingly, a point that I've made just superficially in this conversation, that the amount of suffering and evil that we find really does seem to fall within a narrow range that theism predicts that would actually be quite unexpected if naturalism is true. And he's going to specifically talk even more about the problem of animal suffering as well. And he's got a really interesting theodicy for animals in that book as well. So I think, if I remember the title, I've spent so much time with the book, but I can't remember the title. It's a little embarrassing. I think it's called All God's Creatures. But if you just look up Trent, the problem of animal pain, that's it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Story for All God's Creatures might be the subtitle or something. It is a tremendous book on the problem of evil. Cannot recommend it enough. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your time, Pat. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this. Put in a plug for your channel and anything else.
Well, thank you so much, good sir. I run Philosophy for the People, and that's right on YouTube. So if you just look up Philosophy for the People, you'll see this face, and hopefully you won't be too repelled, and maybe you'll want to subscribe. And then on iTunes, I put a lot of the philosophy episodes on iTunes. I have a much more generalist podcast on iTunes, just called The Pat Flynn Show, very humbly and originally named. And that will include some episodes from Philosophy of the People, but also I talk a lot about like fitness and other stuff on there as well. So it's a blend of different stuff. So that's it. Mm-hmm.
Once again, thank you so much for coming on. Love to have you back on again. Hopefully we'll have you with Dr. Sijuwade again.
That'll be a total blast. He's a brain. I can't recommend his stuff enough. So yeah, thank you, my friend. Always a joy.
And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Also check me out, patreon.com/Reason to Theology if you want to support what we're doing. We'll see you later. God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.